The morning Beatrice Harlan arrived at Ashcroft Manor, she counted 11 rooms that belonged to her by blood, 3 greenhouses her mother had built with her own savings, and one colonel who set a pair of mud-caked field boots on the hall table and told her, without looking up from his correspondence, to have them cleaned before supper. She picked them up. She had her reasons. The carriage that brought her from the village inn was nothing remarkable. She had hired it deliberately, plain black, slightly worn at the door hinges, the kind of carriage that announced nothing about its passenger except that she had somewhere to be and no particular wish to be noticed arriving. Beatrice had dressed with the same intention. A dark wool dress, practical and unremarkable, her hair pinned without any ornament, no jewelry except the small brooch at her collar, turned so the engraving faced inward. She had studied herself in the inn mirror that morning and decided she looked exactly like what she needed to look like. A woman of no particular consequence. Ashcroft Manor appeared through the carriage window at 8:30, and Beatrice felt something move through her chest that she could not have named precisely. Not grief, something older than grief, something that had been sitting in her for the 7 years since she had last seen this house and had compressed itself, in all that time, into something very small and very dense, and very hard to move around. She had been 15 the last time she stood on this drive. She had been holding her mother's hand, and her mother had been holding a letter, and the letter had made her mother's hand go cold. The elm trees along the approach were still there. Everything else felt different, because everything else was. Her mother was dead. Her father was dead. The house, her mother's house, the house her grandfather had built when this land was nothing but field and promise, was currently occupied by a man named Colonel Whitfield, who had no idea she existed, and who had just handed her his boots. She carried them inside without a word. The housekeeper who met her at the servants' entrance was a compact woman in her 60s named Mrs. Crewe. Her expression was professionally unreadable, but her eyes moved over Beatrice with the efficient assessment of a woman who had been categorizing people for 40 years and rarely found cause to revise her first conclusions. Beatrice let her look. She gave her name as Miss Bea Harlan, said she had responded to the advertisement for a household seamstress and correspondence assistant, and hoped she had not arrived at an inconvenient hour. Mrs. Crewe said the hour was acceptable and led her inside. The entrance hall of Ashcroft Manor smelled of beeswax and something faintly mineral, old stone and old wood, and beneath it, very faintly, the particular sweetness of dried roses. Beatrice's mother had kept a bowl of dried petals from the greenhouse on the hall table every winter. Someone still did. The bowl was there. The petals were different, darker, less carefully chosen, but the bowl was her mother's, the one with the small chip on the base, where Beatrice had knocked it off the table at age 8 and never quite confessed to it. She did not look at the bowl. She looked straight ahead. Mrs. Crewe showed her to a room at the back of the house, small and clean, with a window overlooking the west greenhouse. The glass panels caught the morning light and scattered it in long, pale strips across the grass. Beatrice stood at the window and looked at the greenhouse for a long moment, at the slightly overgrown beds visible through the far panel, at the rose stock her mother had spent a decade selecting and grafting and coaxing into something extraordinary, now apparently tended by nobody in particular. She set the boots down beside the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and reached into the inner pocket of her traveling coat. The letter was there, as it always was. Her father's handwriting, small and precise. The hand of a man who had been an engineer before illness had taken the steadiness from his hands, and who had written this particular letter in one of his last steady periods 8 months before he died. She had read it so many times that the paper had softened along the fold lines. She didn't read it now, she only held it. She had not come to Ashcroft Manor because she had nowhere else to go. She had come because her father's letter told her exactly where to look, and because some things, some inheritances, some truths, some debts that the law owed to the living could only be claimed in person, by the right person at the right time. She put the letter away. She picked up the boots. She supposed she ought to clean them. She had cleaned them thoroughly and returned them to the hall table before noon, which apparently surprised someone, because when she came back from the task, she found the kitchen maid watching her with an expression caught between curiosity and something more cautious. Beatrice offered a neutral smile. The kitchen maid said nothing. People in houses like this learned quickly to say nothing, and Beatrice had once been one of them, in a manner of speaking, in the years before she understood what the house was. That afternoon, Mrs. Crewe outlined her duties. She was to assist with correspondence for Colonel Whitfield's sister, Miss Whitfield, who resided in the East Wing and suffered from headaches that made sustained writing difficult. She was to handle basic mending and alterations for the household. She was to take her meals in the housekeeper's sitting room. She was to be, in Mrs. Crewe's precise phrasing, unobtrusive. Beatrice said she understood entirely. She spent the next 2 days learning what had changed and what had not. The third step on the west staircase still groaned. The library door, still stuck in damp weather, and required a firm push at the bottom corner. The morning light still came through the east corridor windows at a particular angle between 9 and 10 that turned the stone floor a color she had no word for except right. The color of things being exactly as they should be. She walked through that light on her second morning and had to stop for a moment, one hand against the wall, and simply breathe. She recovered quickly. No one saw. What had changed? Her father's study had been repurposed as a records room, the furniture replaced, the shelves rearranged in a way that suggested no one had consulted the original order. The portrait of her mother had been removed from the main corridor. Beatrice noticed its absence the way you notice an absent tooth. Not immediately, but with a particular, specific wrongness that arrived a moment after you had already moved past. She found out where it was on her third day, from the gardener. His name was Tomlin. He had worked at Ashcroft Manor for 31 years, which meant he had known the estate when it was Beatrice's family's estate, had known her mother when her mother was alive, had known Beatrice when she was small enough to be carried over the muddy patches between the greenhouse beds without complaint. He was perhaps 70 now, moving slowly through the kitchen garden with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had made his peace with his own pace. When he saw Beatrice crossing the yard, he stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, a careful, unhurried look, and then he removed his hat. Not a nod, not the brief acknowledgement of a gardener greeting household staff. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, the way a man does when he is paying a specific and considered kind of respect. Beatrice met his eyes. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. Tomlin put his hat back on. He said, "Morning, miss," in the exact tone of a man who had encountered a household assistant in a kitchen yard and had nothing further to say about it. That evening, she found a small sprig of greenhouse roses on the sill of her window. They were tied with a piece of garden twine. They were the variety her mother had spent 4 years developing, a deep, particular pink that didn't exist anywhere else, as far as Beatrice knew, except in the beds her mother had planted. She put them in her water glass. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without moving, which was as close as she permitted herself to crying. She had made herself a promise about crying, and she intended to keep it. The cook, a large and comfortable woman named Mrs. Abbott, who had been running the Ashcroft kitchen for 15 years and operated it with the authority of someone who considered herself its rightful sovereign, presented a more complicated situation. Mrs. Abbott had not known the house when it was Beatrice's family's house. She had no reason to recognize her. And yet on Beatrice's fourth morning, when she came to collect the correspondence tray for Miss Whitfield, she found beside it a small covered dish that had not been there the day before. Under the cover was a slice of the kind of cake that was made for the household's formal guests, not for its staff. Beatrice looked at the dish. She looked at Mrs. Abbott, who was at the range with her back turned. "Mrs. Abbott," she said carefully, "I think this may be a mistake." "No mistake," said Mrs. Abbott without turning around. Beatrice stood with the dish in her hand for a moment. "I'm the seamstress," she said. "I can see that," said Mrs. Abbott, and turned around and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had decided something and was not in the habit of revisiting decisions once made. "Eat the cake, miss." Beatrice ate the cake. She did not ask how Mrs. Abbott knew. Some things moved through old houses like heat through stone, slowly and invisibly, and once arrived, completely. Colonel Reginald Whitfield was, she had gathered from her research before arriving, 40 years old, unmarried, and had inherited the lease management of the Ashcroft estate through a chain of legal arrangements that Beatrice's father had laid out in a letter with the careful precision of a man documenting something he feared would be distorted later. The colonel had returned from service abroad 2 years ago. He was said to be fair in his treatment of the household staff, not especially sociable, and in possession of a temper that was generally controlled but not, various sources suggested, inexhaustible. He was not her villain. She had been careful to establish this before she arrived. Her villain was someone else, someone who had been working on this particular problem for 5 years, who had restructured the legal landscape around the Ashcroft estate with the patience and thoroughness of a man who understood that the best way to steal something was to make the theft look like paperwork. Her father's brother, Owen Harlan. The colonel was an inconvenience. Owen was the problem. She first noticed the colonel noticing her on the 5th day. She was in the east corridor, walking slowly with the private indulgence of someone moving through a space that knew her, when she became aware of being watched. She turned. He was at the far end of the hall, not walking toward her, simply standing. His expression was the one she had already catalogued as his default, controlled, slightly removed, the expression of a man who was accustomed to processing his surroundings rather than inhabiting them. What he was looking at was not her. It was what she was standing next to. She turned slightly and felt her breath stop. The door to the left of where she stood had a small framed watercolor beside it. A study of the West greenhouse, her mother's greenhouse, painted by her mother in the 2nd year after they'd moved to Ashcroft, when she had still been learning the English countryside and had filled 3 sketchbooks doing so. The watercolor had always hung there. Someone had left it. Beatrice's hand moved before she could check it. Just slightly, a reaching motion, the involuntary gesture of someone who has been missing something without consciously tracking the missing. She stopped herself, not quickly enough. He had already begun walking toward her. "You know that painting," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Beatrice turned back to him. "I was admiring the composition," she said. "The perspective is unusual." He looked at her. He clearly did not believe this. He also clearly did not know what the truth was, and the uncertainty sat on him with a visible discomfort, like a man who prefers the world to be legible and has encountered a passage he cannot parse. "It came with the house," he said. "It's not a significant work." "No," Beatrice agreed pleasantly, "but it's well observed." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked away without further comment. Beatrice stood in the corridor until his footsteps had receded. Then she turned back to the watercolor and looked at it. The particular way her mother had rendered the light through the greenhouse glass. The small figure visible in the background that was, if you looked closely, a child of perhaps 8 crouching between the rose beds. She pressed 2 fingers very lightly to the corner of the frame. Soon, she said, to the painting, to the house, to the child in the corner of it, who had not known yet that she would need to come back this way. That evening, she read her father's letter again. She did not need to, she knew it entirely. But there was something in the act of reading his handwriting that steadied her, the way the hand of someone you trust can steady you even when the grip is light. The records room was at the end of the east wing, 2 doors past the repurposed study. She had walked past it 4 times without stopping. She knew what she was looking for. She knew approximately where it would be, if her uncle had not yet found it. She did not believe he had. He was expecting the legal process to complete itself in his favor before he needed to look. He had arranged things that way deliberately, with the confidence of a man who had moved all the pieces into position and was waiting for the clock to run. She had, according to her father's letter, a deadline. The condition attached to the will required a formal in-person claim to be filed before a legal witness within 1 year of probate. And probate had been granted 6 months ago, the clock having started, without her knowledge, the moment her uncle had submitted the documentation he controlled. She had 5 weeks when she arrived. She had 3 weeks now. 3 weeks was enough if she was careful. She had learned from Miss Whitfield, who talked with the unguarded freedom of someone who had been lonely for a long time and found in Beatrice an audience without apparent agenda, that Owen Harlan visited the estate monthly. He was expected in 11 days. 11 days was enough if she moved. The complication arrived in the form of Miss Dora Langley. Miss Langley came as a guest of the Colonel's, the daughter of a neighboring family, 24 years old, widely considered an ideal match for a man of his position, and in possession of a quality Beatrice recognized immediately and without warmth. Miss Langley was one of those people who are perfectly calibrated to the room they are performing in, and entirely different in the rooms where no performance is required. In company, she was gracious, light, precisely witty. She asked the Colonel questions that made him think, which Beatrice noted he responded to. In private, she was the kind of woman who addressed staff with a particular flatness in her voice, as though they were pieces of furniture that had developed the inconvenient habit of breathing. She spoke to Mrs. Abbott's kitchen girl once in a tone Beatrice heard from the corridor and then deliberately did not think about, because thinking about it would have required her to do something about it, and she was not yet in a position to do anything about anything. She addressed Beatrice on the second evening. She caught her on the landing above the east staircase, dressed for dinner and looking past her in the way certain people look past things they have decided are beneath their focal range, and said, "You, the collar on my gray dress has come loose again. Come and fix it." Beatrice considered 3 different responses. Then she said, "Of course," and followed her. She fixed the collar. She did it slowly and perfectly, the way she did most things, with the quiet precision of someone who understood that rushing was for people who couldn't afford to be thorough. And as she worked, Miss Langley stood before the mirror and said, to no one in particular and to the room in general, "I can't imagine why a house like this employs a seamstress full-time. Most of the linen wants replacing entirely, not mending." Beatrice said nothing. She finished the collar. She began to rise, and as she did, she brought her voice close enough to Miss Langley's ear to be heard clearly, and said, quietly and without any particular inflection, 4 sentences. She said them once. She did not repeat them. The color left Miss Langley's face in the particular way that color leaves a face when something has been said that the speaker was not supposed to know. And now the listener must calculate very quickly what the knowing of it means and where it came from and who else might know it. Beatrice stepped back. "The collar will hold through dinner," she said. "Enjoy your evening." She left the room. She closed the door quietly behind her. She walked down the east corridor to the back stairs, and when she was certain she was alone, she allowed herself a moment, only a moment, of something that might have been satisfaction. It was a small satisfaction, but small satisfactions sustained her. She had learned to depend on them. Downstairs, the dinner bell sounded. She went to assist Miss Whitfield, and as she guided her along the corridor toward the dining room, they came around a corner and nearly walked into the Colonel coming the other direction. He stepped aside for Miss Whitfield with the automatic courtesy of a man in whom courtesy had become reflex. Then his gaze moved briefly to Beatrice. "Miss Harlan," he said, and then, in a tone that was almost but not quite perfunctory, "Are you settling in well?" It was a host's question, a management question, the kind that required no real answer, but he had stopped, which he did not usually do when they passed in the corridor, and he was waiting with the particular stillness of someone who had actually left space for a response. "Very well, thank you," Beatrice said. "The house is well organized. It makes the work straightforward." He nodded once and moved on. Miss Whitfield took Beatrice's arm and said, in the murmuring way she had of saying things that were more observant than her usual conversation, suggested she was, "He pays attention to more than he shows." Beatrice said nothing, but she thought about it through the rest of the evening. She thought about what she had observed in the corridor with the watercolor, and about the dinner bell redirect when she had heard him, through a half-closed door the following afternoon, steer a conversation away from something that had been moving in a direction he apparently found distasteful. He was not, she revised, indifferent. He was selective. That night, at the small desk in her room, with the greenhouse visible in the darkness below and the sprig of pink roses still in her water glass, she permitted herself one question she had not previously allowed. What kind of man was he going to be, she wondered, when he finally knew the truth? She put the question away. She had 10 days. She could not afford to wonder. Owen Harlan arrived on a Thursday. She knew before she heard the carriage. She had been watching the drive from the landing window with the practiced inattention of someone who appeared to be focusing entirely on untangling a length of lace trim. When the carriage appeared through the oaks at the end of the approach road, she set the lace down with steady hands. Her uncle was 63. He had the kind of face that arranged itself naturally into expressions of ease and openness, the face of a man who expected to be welcomed and had never been required to reconsider that expectation. He was well dressed, silvered at the temples, and possessed of a handshake that Beatrice had learned, at the age of 14, conveyed warmth without conveying any. She did not go to the entrance hall. She watched from the landing. She watched him greet the Colonel with the warm efficiency of a man who considered himself a trusted partner. She watched the Colonel receive him with the neutral courtesy he applied to most things. She watched her uncle's eyes move across the entrance hall with a quick cataloging attention she recognized, the attention of a man who was reminding himself of what was at stake. Then Owen looked up, not at her. He hadn't seen her. She was standing far enough back. He looked up at the house itself, at the entrance hall and the staircase and the light coming through the upper windows, and his expression in that unguarded moment was one Beatrice had seen once before and never forgotten. It was the expression of a man mentally rehearsing ownership. She went back to the lace. She had 9 days. She moved that night. The records room was locked. A newer lock than the house warranted, installed deliberately and recently by someone who understood what was in the room and wanted to manage access carefully. She had noted the lock type on her 2nd day, and noted also, on her 4th, that Mrs. Crewe's key ring held one key that didn't correspond to any door Beatrice had yet accounted for in her movements through the house. Mrs. Crewe's key ring hung on its hook in the housekeeper's office each night after 10 o'clock. Mrs. Crewe slept soundly. Beatrice had established this through the simple means of being quiet on the upper landing for 3 nights in a row. She did not take the key. She borrowed it for 13 minutes, returning it before the hall clock had completed the quarter hour. In those 13 minutes, she moved through the records room with a candle and the focused economy of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and approximately where it will be. Her father had written, in the letter, behind the wainscoting panel on the north wall, second section from the window, "Your grandfather built that room. He built certain things into it that the plans don't show. I know about them because he told me. I am telling you now." The panel was exactly where he had said. The space behind it was cool and dry, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth as her father had always wrapped things that mattered, was an envelope. She did not open it that night. She replaced the panel, returned the key, and went to bed with the envelope inside her traveling coat on the back of the door. She lay in the dark and breathed. She had been patient for a very long time. She allowed herself, for the first time since arriving, to feel the edges of something that might have been relief. She opened the envelope before dawn. 3 documents, her father's will properly executed, witnessed by 2 men whose names she recognized as men of standing. Her father had been careful about that, had understood that the witnesses were half the battle. A letter from the family's solicitor in London, a man named Mr. Adwell, confirming the will's validity and his readiness to receive a formal claim at any time, and a note in her father's compressed, precise hand, "I knew you would find it. I'm sorry it came to this. The house has always been yours, so has everything in it that your mother made. Go claim it properly. I'll be very proud of you, wherever I am." She read the note 3 times. Then she folded everything back into the oilcloth, placed it in the inner pocket of her coat, and went downstairs to collect the morning tray. Mrs. Abbott gave her the good tea without comment. Beatrice drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the greenhouse in the early light. Tomlin came in from the kitchen garden with a basket of late vegetables, saw her face, and gave a single slow nod. She nodded back. The days that followed were the most delicate of her time at Ashcroft. Owen was charming. At dinner, she could hear his voice from the corridor when she passed. The easy warmth of a man performing for an audience he believed entirely won. He was working on the Colonel. She could hear it in the rhythm of it, the way her uncle steered and circled, patient and thorough. A man who had been constructing a particular version of reality for 5 years, and was now presenting it to someone who had no reason yet to question it. She understood the full shape of his plan on the second day of his visit, when she happened to be passing the study with a letter for Miss Whitfield, and the study door, which she had noted several days ago required a deliberate pull to close, was not entirely closed. She did not intend to stop. She stopped because she heard her name. "Beatrice Harlan," her uncle was saying, in the tone of a man sharing something that pained him. "I feel I should say something, Colonel, since I understand she's been engaged here. She is my brother's daughter, and I have a great deal of affection for her. But she has a history of..." A pause, carefully weighted. Instability is perhaps too strong a word. Difficulty with reality, with what is hers and what is not. She has made claims before regarding the estate that proved to be without any legal foundation. I say this not to harm her, only so that if she has said anything, she has said very little to me, the Colonel said. About anything. Good. Her uncle's voice settled with satisfaction. Good. I only mention it because the legal situation is quite settled, and I would not want any confusion to arise from things she might allege. Beatrice stood in the corridor for a count of 3. Then she walked on, because standing still any longer would have required her to make decisions about her hands that she was not ready to make. She delivered the letter. She came back through the corridor. She went upstairs. She sat on the bed. She placed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the window and thought carefully about her breathing. She had expected this. She had always known it was coming, had known since she was 18, and had first begun to understand the architecture of what her uncle had built, the careful layering of documentation and testimony and managed perception that would ensure that any claim she made would arrive already discredited. She had planned for it, and yet hearing it said in her father's house, to a man who had, she had observed this, had filed it with care, begun to look at her as something other than furniture, produced a cold and specific anger that sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She breathed through it. She was still breathing through it when the knock came. Firm, unhurried. She stood and opened the door. The colonel was in the corridor. His expression was the controlled one she knew, but something beneath the control had shifted, a tension she could not entirely read. "Your uncle informs me," he said, "that you have a history of making claims about this estate, claims that proved unfounded." At least he was direct. She had come to appreciate that about him. "Did he show you my father's will?" she said. "He said nothing." "Not a summary," she continued, "not a description of it. The original document, with my father's signature and the solicitor's seal and the witnesses' names." "Did he show you that?" "Silence. Colonel," Beatrice said, and there was something different in her voice now. Not heat, not urgency, but a quality of complete and final steadiness, the voice of a woman who has nothing left to pretend about. "You are preparing to make a decision about a significant property. Before you do, I would like to ask you one question. I would like you to answer it honestly." He waited. "In all your dealings with Owen Harlan regarding this estate," she said, "have you ever seen the original will?" "Not a copy, the original." He held her gaze. Something moved in his face, not belief, not doubt, but the particular expression of a man who has just realized there is a question he should have asked some time ago and did not think to ask. He did not answer. "Thank you," Beatrice said quietly. "That is what I thought." She began to close the door. He put one hand flat against it, not forcefully, just enough to stop it. "Miss Harlan," he said. She waited. "Be careful," he said. 2 words. Low and even. Not an apology, not a declaration of anything. Just 2 words that communicated with minimal efficiency that whatever he was calculating had not resolved itself yet, but that he was not unaware of the variables. Beatrice looked at his hand on the door. She looked at his face. "I have been," she said, "for quite some time." She did not close the door again. He removed his hand, and she watched him walk back down the corridor, and she stood in the doorway of the narrow room that had been given to her like a servant's cell in the house that was her mother's and her grandfather's and would be hers. And she felt the cold anger in her chest settle into something harder and quieter and more durable. That night she did not sleep until well past midnight. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, the particular sounds of it, the breathing of old stone and old timber that she had known since she was small, and she thought about what came next. The document, 5 days remaining on her deadline. The solicitor in London, Mr. Adwell, who had been waiting for exactly this, and then she heard it. A sound from the east wing. Quiet, but not quiet enough. The deliberate, careful sound of someone moving through a room in the dark who should not be there. The records room. She was out of bed before she finished thinking. She put her coat on, lit her candle, and moved into the corridor. The records room door was ajar. The lock had been disengaged by someone who knew what they were doing. She pushed the door open and walked in. Owen Harlan stood on the far side of the room with a lamp in his hand, and the wainscoting panel pulled away from the wall. He was staring at the empty space behind it. When he turned and saw her in the doorway, his face moved through several expressions before it found the one he had decided to deploy: warm concern, the expression of a man who has been deeply worried about someone and is pained to find his concerns validated. "My dear," he said. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "The room is at the end of the wing," Beatrice said. "No one hears anything from here." He stopped. She looked at the empty space behind the panel. She looked at her uncle's face. "It isn't there," she said. She kept her voice perfectly even, whatever you came to find. "It isn't there anymore." He went very still. "I want you to go to bed, Uncle Owen," she said. She held, "We'll finish this in the morning." After a long moment, he walked past her into the corridor without speaking. Beatrice watched him go. She waited until she could no longer hear his footsteps. Then she went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed with one hand pressed flat against the envelope inside her coat and held it there in the dark. 4 days. She could do 4 days. The morning after the records room, she came down to the kitchen and found her uncle already there, which was not where he took his meals, which meant the conversation she had been managing the arrival of was apparently happening now. She sat down. She poured her tea. She waited. He had given up the warm concern expression. What he was wearing now was something closer to honesty, which was, she reflected, the most unsettling version of his face. "You have the document," he said. "Good morning, Uncle." "Don't." She looked at him. This, she thought, was the real voice. She had heard it once before she had been 16, and he had been explaining to her with the patient precision of a man describing something to someone not quite bright enough to grasp it on the past pass that her father's management of his own affairs was a problem that required adult intervention. She had stood in the hall outside the study and memorized the sound of it because she had understood even then that she would need to recognize it again. "You have something," he said. "It will not hold. I have spent 5 years ensuring that anything you produce will be questioned before it reaches anyone who can act on it. I have managed the legal process carefully. I have spoken to the right people." He looked at her. "Whatever document you believe exists, I will have it challenged and set aside before you can place it in front of a magistrate." Beatrice drank her tea. She set the cup down. 5 years, she said. He said nothing. "My father was ill for 18 months before he died," she said. "You began before he was gone." He still said nothing. "I know," she said, simply, the way one states things that have been known for a long time and no longer require the weight of emotion. "I've known for several years. I want you to understand that clearly, not so that you feel caught, so that you stop wasting both our time pretending otherwise." She stood. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her cup. "Enjoy your breakfast," she said. "I believe you are expected to speak with the colonel before noon. I would use the time between now and then to think carefully about what you intend to say." She left him at the table. She spent the morning with Miss Whitfield, who was in better spirits than usual, and talked at considerable length about a concert she had attended in her youth. Beatrice listened and responded and performed her function with steady attention, and underneath the steady attention she was calculating with the focused precision of someone who had 4 days and knew it. The will was legitimate. She had no doubt of that. Her father had been meticulous. The witnesses were solid. The solicitor in London had been holding the original filing for 2 years, waiting for her to come. Handle fulfilled. The copy she carried in the oilcloth was the redundant copy. The original was already safe. What she needed was a legal witness present when she filed her claim in person, or her uncle would challenge the filing as improperly executed. She needed someone whose testimony could not be easily dismissed. She needed this in 4 days. She was working through the logistics of this when the knock came at Miss Whitfield's sitting room door. A footman, addressing himself to Beatrice, which was irregular. "The colonel would like to see Miss Harlan in the library," he said, at her convenience. Miss Whitfield looked at her with the mild, interested expression of a woman who had spent 3 weeks watching and was glad something was finally happening. The colonel was standing at the library window when she came in. He turned. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept much and had arrived at a decision through the sleeplessness rather than despite it. "Sit down," he said. Beatrice remained standing. He moved away from the window. He came and stood near the chair across from her, and she had noticed over the preceding weeks that he had a habit of placing himself at the particular distance that gave a person room. Not too close, not the managed distance of someone maintaining formality, but the instinctive distance of a man who understood that some conversations required space to breathe. She did not think he was aware of it. "Your uncle came to see me this morning," he said. "He repeated what he told me before, that you are unstable, that your claims are without foundation, that any document you produce should be treated with significant skepticism." "Yes," Beatrice said. "He would say that. He has been building that case for 5 years. The colonel was quiet. He was looking at her with the expression she had been cataloging for weeks, the one that lived under his neutrality like something that hadn't finished deciding what it was. "He also told me," he said, more slowly, "that you were in the records room last night." "We were both in the records room last night," Beatrice said. "He arrived first." A pause. What was he looking for? The same thing I found 4 days ago. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. It was the silence of a man rearranging several things at once. "You found something," he said. "4 days ago. And you said nothing." "I was waiting," Beatrice said, "to understand what kind of man you were." He was still for a long moment. "And do you?" It was a genuine question. She had learned to tell the difference between his genuine questions and his management questions. This was genuine. She looked at him, at the controlled set of his jaw, and the careful steadiness of his posture, and the space he had left between them without appearing to have left it. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are a man who makes his assessments quickly and revises them slowly. I think you were handed a situation you did not create and have managed it with the information you had, which has been deliberately incomplete. I think you are not my uncle's instrument." She paused. "That last point was not something I was certain of when I arrived." "That is not entirely a compliment," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it is what I think." He sat down then, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which she had never seen him do, and which struck her as the most honest posture she had observed from him. "Show me," he said. Beatrice reached into the inner pocket of her dress and placed the oilcloth envelope on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not reach for it immediately. He looked at it with the expression of a man who understands that what is in front of him will change things and is taking one moment before the change. Then he picked it up. He opened it carefully. He read. She watched his face while he read. He was thorough. She had expected that. She saw the precise moment he reached the ownership clause, because something in the line of his jaw shifted. He read the solicitor's letter. He read her father's note last, and was quiet for a long time after it. He set the documents down with the particular care of someone who has understood what they are handling. "Why didn't you simply tell me?" he said. She had prepared an answer for this. A measured, strategic answer. She did not give it, because what came out instead was, "I needed to know what you would do with the power to destroy me before I handed it to you." He said nothing. "My uncle has spent 5 years ensuring that my word alone means nothing," she continued. "If I had arrived at Ashcroft and announced myself on the first day, you would have had 2 choices. Believe me or believe him. You had no reason to believe me, none at all." She paused. "I have known men who would have used that." The colonel was very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that had less protection in it than anything she had observed in the preceding weeks. "The boots," he said. She met his eyes. "The boots," she said. He stood abruptly and went to the window. She watched his back, the quality of his stillness, Not the stillness of a man at rest, but of a man working very hard at something internal. "The deadline," he said. "When?" "4 days." He turned. "I need to go to London." "I know. Tonight." "Yes." He looked at her across the library, her grandfather's library, the room where she had learned to read, where the shelves still held the same titles in the same order, because no one had thought to rearrange them, where the windowsill still had a faint discoloration from a jar of India ink that her mother had knocked over, and that 30 years of housekeeping had not entirely erased. "The will is legitimate," he said. "I'm not questioning it. I know you're not. Your uncle will challenge it regardless." He stopped. "My position in this, the legal entanglement, I need to speak to my own solicitor before I can tell you with certainty what I can and cannot do." "I am not asking you to do anything," Beatrice said. "You should be." He said it with a directness that sat in the room between them with more weight than anything else he had said. "What do you need?" "A witness," she said. "A legal witness present when I file, whose testimony cannot be easily dismissed. Someone whose word carries weight without requiring argument." "I'm a colonel," he said in the tone of a man stating a logistical fact. "My word carries weight." She said nothing. "I will ride tonight," he said. "You will come with me. We will be in London before the solicitor's office opens, and the claim will be filed before your uncle realizes we have left." He picked up the documents from the table and held them out to her. "Keep these on your person." She took them. She looked at them in her hands. Then she looked at him. "Why?" she said. Genuinely. She wanted to know. He seemed briefly caught by the question. Then, as if the admission required some effort, "Because it is the right thing to do." "A beat. And because I handed you a pair of boots." Beatrice looked at him for a moment. "The mud on the left one was particularly thorough," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'll be ready in an hour," he said. She nodded. She walked to the library door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. "Colonel," she said. He looked at her. "My father's note. The one at the bottom of the envelope. I'd like it back when this is finished." "Of course," he said. She left. They rode out at 10 at night, through the rear gate and down the back lane that ran along the eastern edge of the estate, away from the main approach where anyone watching might see them go. The colonel had brought 2 horses and no carriage, which she hadn't expected, and had looked at her small trunk and then at the horses and said, simply, "We'll make better time. Can you ride?" "I grew up on this property," Beatrice said. He accepted this and helped her mount with the impersonal efficiency of a man performing a practical function. And they were moving before she had entirely registered that they were going. She had ridden this lane as a child. In the dark, with the smell of the fields around her and the sound of hooves on packed earth, she felt the disorientation of a place known in daylight appearing entirely different at night. The structure familiar, the feeling strange, like a face in unexpected light. They stopped past midnight at a coaching inn to rest the horses. The colonel procured tea and food without being asked, and they sat at a rough table in the empty front room and ate in silence, and Beatrice thought, 3 days. "Your uncle will know by morning," the colonel said. He was looking at the table. "He'll go to the study first, find you gone. Then he'll find Mrs. Crewe, and she'll tell him I left with you, because she is honest and he will press her." She drank her tea. "He'll assume London. He'll send someone ahead. He won't get there before us. But it needs to be done before noon, or the advantage disappears." "I understood the noon constraint before we left," the colonel said, with a dryness that surprised her into something close to a smile. They reached London in the early gray morning. Mr. Adwell's offices were on Garrick Street, and Beatrice had sat across from that careful, meticulous man twice before, had placed her father's letter in his hands and watched him receive it with the gravity of someone who understood exactly what he was holding and was not in any hurry to mishandle it. He had told her, "When you are ready, come to me." She had written to him 3 days ago. She had not received a reply. He was there when they arrived. He opened the door himself and looked at Beatrice with the expression of a man who has been waiting and is relieved that the waiting is finite. Then he looked at the colonel behind her and recalibrated several things at once. "Miss Harlan," he said. "Mr. Adwell," she said. "This is Colonel Whitfield. He is here as a witness." What followed was 2 hours of the most careful legal work Beatrice had ever witnessed. Mr. Adwell read every document twice. He asked her questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable, and she answered all of them with the accuracy of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. The colonel sat in the corner of the room and said nothing unless addressed, and when addressed, answered with the directness of a man who understood that his presence in the room was doing its work without embellishment. At one point, Mr. Adwell looked at him over his spectacles and said, "You are prepared to provide a signed statement attesting to your presence here and to the examination of these documents and your observation that they appear regularly executed?" "I am," the colonel said. "And you are prepared to stand behind that statement if it is challenged?" "Mr. Adwell," the colonel said, with patience that had a very faint edge to it, "I rode through the night to be in this room. I am prepared." At 17 minutes before noon, Beatrice signed her name to the formal claim. Mr. Adwell signed below it. The colonel signed as witness. Mr. Adwell pressed his seal into the wax. "It is done, Miss Harlan," he said quietly. "The claim is properly filed. The estate is yours." Beatrice looked at the document on the desk, at her name on it, and her father's name above it and the seal. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. They were back on Garrick Street at noon exactly, and Beatrice stood on the pavement in the gray London morning and breathed. "It will still be challenged," the colonel said. "Yes. He'll file a counterclaim within the week. There will be proceedings. But the deadline is met." "The deadline is met," he said. A pause. Then, with visible effort as if the words required assembly, "I owe you more than an apology for the boots." She looked at him in the morning light, away from Ashcroft, away from the household and the tangle of titles and histories, and he looked, she found, tired. Simply tired. A man who had ridden through the night and was standing on a London pavement and had said something honest. "You owe me nothing," she said. He looked at her. "That's not. You came when I needed you to come," she said more gently. "You signed what needed to be signed. That is more than I had any right to expect from someone in your position." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she did not examine too closely, because she was tired and the moment already had enough in it. "We should eat," he said finally. "Yes," she said. They found a quiet place near the Strand and ate properly for the first time in 20 hours and talked about things that were not legal proceedings. He told her he had not been back to London in over a year and found it louder than he remembered. She told him about the bookshops she had haunted during the 2 years she had spent in the city, saving and planning. And he said he had not been inside a bookshop in 3 years. And she told him that was a significant personal failing. And he looked briefly startled, and then, unexpectedly, quietly, he laughed. It was, she thought, a very good laugh. She filed it away. They rode back to Ashcroft in the afternoon. They came through the front door to find Mrs. Crewe in the entrance hall, and the expression on Mrs. Crewe's face stopped Beatrice completely. What followed she had not anticipated. Owen Harlan, before leaving that morning, had spoken at length with Miss Whitfield. He had been thorough and patient and convincing. Beatrice understood this without being surprised by it, because he was always thorough and patient and convincing, and Miss Whitfield had been distressed and had requested, through Mrs. Crewe, that Miss Harlan's employment be terminated and that she leave the premises before dinner. Beatrice stood in the entrance hall of her grandfather's house and looked at the floor. She looked at the colonel. His face was controlled, completely controlled. The controlled face she had catalogued in the early days, but underneath the control, something was working very hard. He said nothing, and she understood, in the way that certain things arrive whole and without warning, that his sister's distress sat on him with a weight she had not fully accounted for, that whatever had been said to Miss Whitfield had landed in ground that was already prepared, that the man who had ridden through the night and laughed at a bookshop comment and signed his name beside hers was now standing between his sister's instruction and his own knowledge, and had not yet decided which way to move. The silence stretched. Beatrice made the decision for him. "Thank you, Mrs. Crewe," she said. Her voice was even. It was always even. "I'll go and pack hock, Miss Harlan," the colonel said. "It's quite all right," she said. She did not look at him. "I'll be no more than an hour." She walked up the stairs. She walked down the corridor to her small room and closed the door behind her, and stood in the middle of it with her coat still on and the oilcloth envelope against her ribs. She gave herself 30 seconds, exactly 30. Then she opened her trunk and began to fold things into it. She was methodical. She was always methodical. She folded each item with the precise care of someone who has packed in difficult circumstances before and understands that the hands must be occupied when the mind cannot be. She was nearly finished when she saw the roses on the windowsill, Tomlin's roses, past their best now, the petals beginning to drop. She looked at them for a moment. She left them. She wrote a letter. She wrote it in her father's handwriting style, compact, unhurried, and when she was done she folded it without sealing it and left it on the desk. She picked up her trunk, walked out of the room, and did not look back at it. Mrs. Crewe made a motion to take the trunk from her in the entrance hall. Beatrice declined with a smile. Mrs. Abbott appeared from the kitchen corridor, and her face, when she saw the trunk, did something complicated. Beatrice looked at her and gave the same small motion she had given Tomlin on the second morning. "Not yet. But it's coming." She asked for a carriage. She stood in the entrance hall and waited. She did not look at the east corridor where the watercolor was. The colonel came down the stairs. He descended them with the look of a man who has reached a conclusion through considerable internal effort and is committed to delivering it. Beatrice watched him come down and thought, here it is. She had wondered, she realized, since nearly the beginning. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had been disciplined about it. But she had wondered. He reached the bottom. He stopped. He looked at her trunk. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. "Please don't," Beatrice said. He closed it. "Whatever you are about to say," she said quietly, "I would prefer you didn't. I am tired, and I have the document, and the claim is filed, and I will be perfectly fine." She paused. "I always have been." She picked up her trunk and walked out the front door of Ashcroft Manor into the evening air. The carriage came. She got in. She did not look back at the house as they drove away through the oak trees. She looked straight ahead. She held the envelope against her ribs with one hand and the edge of the seat with the other, and she breathed. On the desk in her room, the letter she had left sat open and unread. She did not know when he would find it. She did not know what he would do when he did. She was very tired. She had done everything correctly. The house was hers, on paper and in law, and tomorrow it would begin to be hers in fact. And none of that changed the particular hollow feeling in her chest as the carriage moved down the drive and the lights of Ashcroft went away in the dark behind her. She had not permitted herself to want this. Not the house. The house she had always allowed herself to want. She had not permitted herself to want whatever it was that came after. The part she had told herself was irrelevant to the plan. She was very good at not permitting herself things. She put the thought away. The letter on the desk said, "Colonel, I have left the records room key with Mrs. Crewe. I borrowed it twice. She may not have noticed, but you should know. The roses along the south wall of the second greenhouse want cutting back before winter. Tomlin knows how my mother preferred it done. He has been waiting to be asked. The watercolor in the east corridor is my mother's work. She painted it in the second year, after my family came to Ashcroft, when she was still learning the English countryside, and filled 3 sketchbooks doing so. The small figure in the background is me. I was 8. I would like it to stay in the east corridor when the house is mine again, where the morning light reaches it. I do not write this to make you feel anything in particular. I write it because these things should be known by whoever lives in this house, and you have lived in it, and perhaps you will remember. Thank you for London. I mean that without qualification. Beatrice Harlan. The Colonel read it standing at the desk in the small room that smelled faintly of roses. He had come looking for her 40 minutes after she left. He had stood in the entrance hall for a portion of that time, saying nothing to anyone, and then he had gone upstairs with the particular purposefulness of a man who has made a decision and is moving before it can be reconsidered. He read the letter twice. He stood at the window and looked at the greenhouse in the dark. At the wall he could barely see. At the rose beds. He thought about a woman who had arrived at his door, at her door, with a modest trunk and a plain dress, and her mother's watercolor on the wall behind her, and who had cleaned his boots and said nothing and waited with a patience he was only now understanding the full depth of, for the truth to have room enough to exist. He thought about what he had done at the bottom of the stairs. He had done nothing. He had stood there and said nothing, and watched her pick up her trunk and walk out her own front door, and he had told himself there were reasons. Practical reasons, his sister's distress, the legal complexity, the time required. And the reasons had felt like reasons at the time. He was standing at the desk with her letter in his hand, and he understood that they had not been reasons. They had been the habits of a man who was accustomed to managing things from a measured distance and calling it judgment. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat. He went to his sister first. Miss Whitfield looked up from her embroidery when he came in, with the expression of a woman who expected to be agreed with. "Owen Harlan is not a man I trust," he said, before she could speak. "He is a man who has been managing an estate that does not legally belong to him for 5 years. He came to this house to prevent the rightful owner from claiming it, and he used you to do it." His sister stared at him. "She is the rightful owner," he said. "I sat in a London solicitor's office this morning and watched her file a claim with a properly executed will and 2 witnesses, and the seal of a man who has been holding the filing for 2 years waiting for her. The estate has always been hers." He looked at his sister steadily. "We have been living in it?" The silence in the room was considerable. Miss Whitfield set down her embroidery. She had the look of a woman doing rapid, uncomfortable revision. To her credit, she did not protest, she sat with it. She looked at her hands. "She never said a word," she said finally, not defensively, with something closer to wonder. "Not once in all those mornings." "No," he said. "She didn't." His sister was quiet for another moment, then carefully. "She was very patient with my headaches." "I know." She listened. A pause. Most people don't listen. He left his sister's sitting room and found Mrs. Crewe and asked the single question that mattered. Where had Miss Harlan asked the carriage to take her? "The coaching inn at Weston Cross," Mrs. Crewe said. She had left perhaps 3 hours ago. She had intended from there to travel toward London. 3 hours. He was in the stable yard 8 minutes later. Tomlin appeared from the kitchen garden side and looked at him with an expression of absolute unhurried assessment that reminded him, with a clarity he found clarifying, of Beatrice's own face. "The coaching inn at Weston Cross," the Colonel said. "She left 3 hours ago. Do you know how long the last coach to London waits?" Tomlin looked at him. "It's Thursday," the colonel said. "Coaches wait longer on Thursdays," Tomlin said. "Driver takes supper." The colonel mounted. He looked down at the old man. "The roses," he said, "along the south greenhouse wall. She wants them cut back before winter, her mother's way." Something shifted in Tomlin's face. Not surprise, the expression of a man who has been patient for a very long time and is watching the patience finally account for something. "I know how," Tomlin said. "I've been waiting to be asked." The colonel nodded and rode. He rode hard. The road to Weston Cross was 5 miles, and he covered it with the focused urgency of a man who has identified precisely what he should have done 2 hours ago and is correcting the error with all available speed. The night was clear. The road was dry. What he intended to say when he arrived was less clear, which he set aside on the grounds that certain things could not be prepared for, only arrived at. The coaching inn at Weston Cross was lit and warm against the dark, and the coach was still in the yard, the driver visible through the window of the front room, arguing cheerfully with someone about the road condition east of the village. He pulled up, dismounted, and went inside. The room was low-ceilinged and warm, and full of the particular smell of public rooms that had been absorbing travelers for 100 years, perhaps a dozen people. He scanned the room. She was in the far corner, her traveling coat on, her small trunk beside her chair, a cup of tea in front of her. She was not reading, not doing anything, just sitting with the stillness she always had. The stillness of someone who has been trained by circumstance to conserve everything, attention and energy and hope, and she had not yet seen him. He crossed the room. She looked up when he was 4 feet away, and her face did something he had not seen it do in all the time he had been watching it. The composure was there, and then it wasn't, just for a moment, and what was underneath it, in that unguarded instant, was something he felt in his chest, with an accuracy that left him no room for uncertainty. She recovered. Of course she did. "Colonel," she said. Her voice was even. "Don't," he said. He sat down across from her without being asked and leaned forward, elbows on the table, because he had ridden 5 miles in the dark specifically to say this directly, and he was not going to waste the angle. "I stood at the bottom of the stairs," he said, "and I said nothing." Beatrice said nothing. "That was wrong," he said. "Not legally, you are protected. The claim is filed. But it was wrong. You walked out of your own house carrying your own trunk, and I stood there, and I had reasons, and they were not reasons. They were habits." He held her gaze. "I got on a horse." She looked at him, the expression he had spent weeks trying to categorize. "Your sister," she began. "She knows," he said. "I told her everything. She is revising her opinions. She has good instincts when no one is actively working to manipulate them. She is not pleased with herself. She is less pleased with your uncle." Something moved at the corner of Beatrice's mouth. "The legal proceedings will begin next week," he said. "Your uncle will file a counterclaim. Your solicitor expects 6 to 8 weeks. During that time, the estate is in a complicated position legally." He held her gaze. "I would like you to come back to Ashcroft, not as seamstress, not as staff, as its owner, while the proceedings resolve." She looked at him. "My sister would like to apologize to you," he said. "She will arrive at it indirectly, through several conversations about other things, but she will get there." "She is thorough," Beatrice said. "When she commits to something." "Yes," he said. "I have had 40 years of it." She looked at the table. She looked at her tea. She looked at the trunk beside her chair, and at the room around them, and at the man across the table who had ridden through one night for a document and through another for a different reason entirely, and was looking at her now with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize. "There is one more thing," he said. He reached into his coat. "Not the will, not the solicitor's letter." A letter, older, the paper slightly worn. He placed it on the table. "I found it in my father's papers when I inherited," he said. I read it and didn't understand it at the time. I understand it now." She picked it up. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the name at the top was not. Her father had written to his father years ago, before the illness, before any of it, a letter between two men who had known each other in the uncomplicated way that neighbors sometimes did, without ceremony and without the need to formalize what was understood between them. The letter said one thing: "If anything should happen to me and Beatrice is alone, watch for her if you can. She will not ask for help. She never has. But she will need someone to see past the not asking." She read it to the end. She held it for a moment. She set it down on the table between them. Outside, the coachman called the final boarding. Nobody at their table moved. "He knew your father," Beatrice said. "Apparently," he said. "Rather better than either of us knew." She looked at the letter. She looked at him. "In the library," she said, "you asked me if I knew what kind of man you were. You said you thought I made assessments quickly and revised them slowly. I did." She looked at him. "I have revised that?" The coachman called again. "I think," Beatrice said slowly, "that you are a man who stands at the bottom of a staircase and says nothing, and then rides 5 miles in the dark on a Thursday because he could not let the nothing be the last thing." He held her gaze. Outside, the stage was beginning to move. Neither of them looked at it. "The watercolor," she said, "in the east corridor. It will be where it belongs before you return," he said. "Tonight." She looked at him. Then she reached out and took her father's letter from the table and placed it inside her coat. And she stood, and she picked up her trunk, and she looked at him with the expression he had, she decided, earned the right to see clearly. "Well then," she said. "Well then," he said. They walked out of the coaching inn together into the clear night, and above them the sky was wide and full of stars, and the road back to Ashcroft stretched ahead of them pale and certain in the dark. He took the trunk from her without comment. She let him. They rode. A year later, Ashcroft Manor in the full of summer was the kind of beautiful that required no description, only presence. Beatrice had always known this. She had carried it through 2 years of London rooms and 1 winter in a house that smelled of other people's circumstances. But knowing a thing and standing inside it were different, and she had learned, was still learning, to stand inside it without the old habit of holding good things slightly away from herself in case they proved impermanent. They had not proved impermanent. The legal proceedings had taken 11 weeks, not 6, because Owen Harlan had challenged everything with the aggressive thoroughness of a man with nothing remaining to lose and a great deal to answer for. He had challenged the will's execution, the witness statements, the filing date, and at one point, with the creative desperation of a cornered man, the competence of the original notary. Mr. Adwell had addressed every challenge with the unhurried precision of someone who had been preparing for this particular opposition considerably longer than Owen had been preparing to mount it. The colonel's signed testimony had been, as he had predicted in Mr. Adwell's office on Garrick Street, not easily discredited. The estate was formally returned to Beatrice Harlan on a Tuesday morning in early November. Mr. Adwell sent a letter. She read it at the breakfast table, the proper breakfast table, in the dining room, where she had been taking her meals since the morning after her return, and set it down and looked at the window. Miss Whitfield, who had taken to joining her most mornings on the grounds that it did her headaches more good than anything else she had tried, looked at her face. "Is it done?" she said. "It's done," Beatrice said. Miss Whitfield reached across the table and patted her hand with the warm efficiency of a woman who had completed her revision several weeks prior and arrived at a genuine and uncomplicated fondness. The apology had come as the colonel had predicted. Through several indirect conversations, including a lengthy meditation on the untrustworthiness of men who smiled with both eyes and a discussion of a summer she had spent in Bath that seemed, to Beatrice, not entirely relevant, before arriving one morning over tea as a quiet, direct, "I am sorry, my dear. I was made a fool of, and you paid for it." Beatrice had accepted it without theater, and they had both been relieved to move on. Owen Harlan had left the county before the proceedings concluded. His name was not spoken at Ashcroft Manor, which was not a rule anyone had stated aloud, and which everyone observed without discussion. The proceedings had also, in their final weeks, surfaced irregularities in his management of the estate accounts over the preceding 5 years, irregularities that Mr. Adwell had referred quietly to the appropriate parties and which were now someone else's concern. Beatrice had been informed. She had noted it and moved forward, what she had moved toward at the pace that both of them seemed to require, neither hurrying nor retreating, with the comfortable unhurriedness of two people who have already survived enough that they have no interest in wasting the good part, was Reginald. She had started thinking of him as Reginald sometime in the 3rd week after her return. She had not told him this. He had started calling her Beatrice, not Miss Harlan, simply Beatrice, around the same time. Neither of them had remarked on the transition. They had talked. This was the central fact of it, not the proceedings, not the social arithmetic of their respective positions, not the county's opinion, which had been briefly surprised and then rapidly accepting, in the way that counties were when a colonel made his intentions clear. They had talked at length, in the library and the garden, and on horseback along the eastern edge of the property, where the fields were wide and the conversation had room. He had told her about the years abroad, about the engagement that had ended. A woman named something she couldn't recall, who had not waited, and whom he did not blame, he said, though it had taken him time to arrive at not blaming her. About the quietness that had come back with him, which Miss Whitfield found worrying, and which he described as a recalibration, the sense of a man returned to a life that fit him differently than it had when he left. She had told him about London, about the rooms and the planning and the particular discipline of 2 years spent preparing for something without knowing exactly when it would become possible, about her mother, the real woman, not the subject of a legal document, but the woman who had built 3 greenhouses from her own design and filled them with roses that didn't exist anywhere else, and had a laugh that Beatrice could still hear clearly if she stood in the right part of the garden, about her father who had been meticulous and gentle, and had taught her that patience was not the same as passivity, that waiting with intention was its own form of action. He had listened. She had already known he could, but there was a difference between observing that a man could listen and having him listen to you. And the difference had mattered more than she had expected. He had asked her in November, in the library. In the particular direct way that she had come to understand was his form of tenderness, not the elaborate preamble of a man managing a conversation, but the plain speech of someone who has decided to say the thing, whether she would consider making the arrangement permanent. He had said, "I have been trying to imagine this house without you in it, and I find I cannot," which I think means something. I would rather know what you think it means than spend another winter being sensible about it. She had looked at him across the library, her grandfather's library, their library, and had thought about 11 rooms and 3 greenhouses, and one man who had handed her a pair of muddy boots without looking at her face, and one man sitting across from her now who had not stopped looking the 5th day, since approximately the 5th day. She had said yes, simply, the way she said things she meant. Now it was summer, and the manor was full of light, and the south greenhouse roses were blooming with the unreasonable abundance of things that have been properly tended after years of being merely maintained. Beatrice had stood at the window the morning she first saw them at their full height and felt been incomplete for a long time. Varied rivies, then Tomlin still tipped his hat to her when she crossed the yard. He still did it with the specific gravity of a man giving freely what he had withheld for years. Beatrice still gave him the nusmal nod she had given him on the second morning, and between them it had become a private language, a shorthand for everything that had been understood without being said. Mrs. Abbott still gave her the good tea. Mrs. Crewe remained professionally neutral and absolutely reliable, and had accepted the changes in the household with the equanimity of a woman who had suspected for some time that something was not as it appeared, and was not surprised to have been proven right. In the entrance hall, on the narrow console table beside the front door, in a small glass case that Reginald had commissioned from a craftsman in the village, and installed himself on a Saturday morning without telling her what he was doing until it was done, a pair of old field boots sat on a square of dark cloth, still muddy. Guests always asked about them. There was something about the deliberateness of the display, the case, the velvet, the particular placement, that made the question irresistible. And there was always at every dinner someone who could not help it. Beatrice always answered. She told it simply, the way her father had taught her to tell things, without embellishment, without false modesty, without the performance of either. She told it the way it was. A woman who arrived at her own house without announcing herself, who picked up a pair of boots and said nothing and waited, because she had learned that some truths need time and space and the right witness before they are able to exist properly in the world. Reginald listened every time. He had heard it perhaps a dozen times. He stood at the edge of the room where she told it, with the expression she had stopped trying to categorize and simply recognized. And when she reached the part about the boots, he always looked at her with that expression, and she always, without entirely intending to, looked back. He told his version occasionally. It was shorter. He said, I handed her a pair of muddy boots and didn't look at her face, and then I got on a horse. Beatrice always added, he rode 5 miles in the dark on a Thursday night, and I would like that on the record. It was always noted. On an evening in late June, a year and some weeks from the morning, she had stepped out of a plain hired carriage and walked back into her family's house. Beatrice sat in the south garden as the light went down. The roses were at their height. The air was warm, and the greenhouse glass caught the last of the sun and scattered it across the grass in long, pale lines, and the whole of the garden smelled of what her mother had spent a decade building here. Reginald came and sat beside her. He said nothing immediately, which she had long since identified as one of his better qualities. He sat with the ease of a man in a place that fit him, and she sat beside him with the same ease. After a while he said, Tomlin says the east greenhouse bed wants new support along the back wall. I know, Beatrice said. I told him to go ahead. He was waiting for you to say so. He always waits for me. Reginald was quiet for a moment. Then, you've been telling this garden what to do since you were a child. Since I was 7, she said. I was 5 when I started listening to it. He looked at her. She looked at the roses. The evening light was the particular gold of summer at its height, the kind of light that didn't hold and that she had learned to receive fully, without the old habit of holding back. She had been patient for a very long time. She was done being patient now. She had the house and the greenhouses and the roses along the south wall and the watercolor in the east corridor where the morning light reached it, and the letter her father had written in his last steady hand, and the man sitting beside her who had understood, finally and entirely, that she had not needed saving, only witnessing. She reached out and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers back, without comment, without ceremony, the way he did everything she had come to depend on, quietly and completely, and with no apparent intention of letting go. In the entrance hall, in their glass case, the muddy boots sat exactly where he had placed them. Guests always asked. Beatrice always smiled and said they belonged to a woman who had learned the difference between patience and passivity, who had understood that waiting with intention was its own form of courage, and that some houses, some truths, and some people were worth every quiet and deliberate day of the wait. She never mentioned that the woman was her. She never needed to.